There is a hole in my parachute, 30 caliber, punched clean through the pack that was strapped to my chest. I did not know it was there until the whole thing was over. I wore that chute through the worst of it, and then I threw it down on the deck of a burning bomber because I could not move fast enough with it on. Later, when I picked it up off the floor, I found the hole. That parachute was my way home. 3 men on this crew used theirs. I watched the radio operator come out of the flames and dive through the gun hatch. He hit the horizontal stabilizer on the way down, bounced off it, and his chute opened over open water. He had no life vest on. I believe the fire had already burned it off him. None of those 3 men was ever found. I stayed. And before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. I did not stay because I was brave. May 1st, 1943, my first combat mission. Let me tell you what I was before any of this. In the late summer of 1942, I walked into a recruiting office in Michigan and put my name on a piece of paper. Maynard Harrison Smith, 31 years old, 5'4". Understand what that meant in a room full of enlistees. The boys around me were 19, 20, 21. Farm kids with necks like fence posts still growing into their shoulders. I was a decade older than most of them and half a head shorter than nearly all of them. When we lined up, I was the man at the end of the row that the sergeant had to look down at. I was also, by then, twice married and twice divorced. The record shows something else, too. On the 3rd of September 1942, 3 days after I enlisted, a local paper carried the notice in its divorce column: Helen Smith, separating from Maynard H. Smith. Grounds: cruelty and non-support. 3 days. Now, there is a story that has followed me ever since. The story goes that I was hauled in front of a judge over money I owed for my own child, and that the judge gave me a choice, a jail cell or a uniform. The story goes that a photographer caught me leaving for service, still wearing handcuffs. I want to be honest with you about that story, because you deserve better than a legend. No one has ever produced that photograph. No court record has ever surfaced. It is a story, and it may be nothing more than a story. But the divorce notice is real. The date on it is real. And whatever it was that brought me through the door of that recruiting office, it was not a flag, and it was not a speech, and it was not a burning conviction about the fate of Europe. I went because staying was worse. They trained me as a gunner. Men have offered explanations for that over the years. The usual one is that a gunner earned his stripes faster than almost anyone else in the Army Air Forces. More rank, more pay, and quicker than a man could get it any other way. And that a 31-year-old with a ruined marriage behind him and nothing in front of him would have noticed that. I will let that stand as somebody else's theory. I never wrote down my reasons. What I did not fully understand at the time was which seat they intended to put me in. They called it the ball turret. Picture a sphere of steel and glass, roughly the size of a bathtub, bolted to the underside of a flying fortress. 250 caliber machine guns run out of it like tusks. Inside, there is a seat, and there are handles, and there is nothing else. You do not climb into a ball turret. You fold into it. Your knees come up beside your ears. Your back curls. Your face sits inches from armored glass, and beneath that glass is nothing at all. 25,000 feet of empty air between you and the ground. When the guns fire, the whole ball shudders around your spine. When the temperature outside drops to 40 below, the cold leaps up through the aluminum and finds your knees first. And there is one more thing about that ball. And it is the thing that matters most in this story. There is no room in it for a parachute. Not folded, not strapped, not stowed. The space simply does not exist. So the chute stays inside the fuselage above you, on the far side of a small hatch. To reach it, you must first rotate the turret until that hatch lines up with the opening in the floor. Then you unlatch. Then you climb out. Electricity does that rotation for you. When the electricity is gone, you do it by hand, one crank at a time, curled inside a steel ball, while the aircraft around you does whatever it is doing. Every man in the 8th Air Force knew this, which is why almost nobody volunteered for that seat. They put me in it because I fit. The 306th Bomb Group flew out of Thurley, England, a scatter of hard stands and Nissen huts and mud in Bedfordshire, and the smell of 100-octane fuel that never quite came out of your clothes. This was the spring of 1943, and the 8th Air Force was still learning, in blood, what daylight bombing over Europe actually cost. I arrived, and I did what I have always done. I did not make friends. I want to be plain about this, because the version of this story you may have heard tends to soften it, and I would rather you had it straight. I was not a quiet man who was misunderstood. I was difficult, I argued. I did not take an order gracefully when I thought the order was stupid, and I thought a great many orders were stupid. I turned up late. I had opinions about men who had been flying combat for 6 months, while I had flown none. They found a name for me almost immediately. There was a comic strip running in the papers back home. A squat, cantankerous little hillbilly with a shotgun and a permanent grievance. Snuffy Smith. That is what they called me. Snuffy. It was not affection, it was a description. And so the crews went up without me. The bombers formed over Bedfordshire in the grey mornings and climbed away east. And I stood on the ground and watched them go. Then I stood on the ground and watched them come back with holes in them. And I counted, the way everybody on that field counted, and sometimes the count came out wrong, and a hard stand stayed empty. 6 weeks went by like that. A gunner, trained and rated, and drawing his pay, and no crew on the station that wanted him in their airplane. There is a particular loneliness in that, not the loneliness of being alone, the loneliness of being surplus, of standing among 2,000 men who are all going somewhere together and knowing that not one of them would pick you. I told myself I did not care. I had been unwanted before. I had practice. Then, at the end of April 1943, my name went up on the board. The briefing room was cold and full of smoke, and the sound of 100 men not quite talking. When the cloth came off the map, there was a ribbon of yarn running down across the Channel, across Brittany, to a point on the French coast. Saint-Nazaire. You could hear it move through the room. The veterans had a name for that target, and the name was Flak City. Beneath those docks were the concrete pens where the U-boats slept, roofs thick enough to shrug off anything we carried, defended by anti-aircraft crews who had been doing nothing else for 2 years and had gotten very good at it. That was my first combat mission, not a milk run along the coast. Saint-Nazaire. I was assigned to aircraft 649, and there were 2 things about that assignment I did not properly appreciate at the time. The first was the pilot, First Lieutenant Lewis P. Johnson, Jr., a steady man, well thought of. The second was our position in the formation. There is a place in a bomber formation that everyone understands and nobody wants. The low squadron, the bottom corner, the airplane with no one beneath it and no one behind it, hanging out in the open air like a loose thread. That was 649. The lowest aircraft in the entire group, carrying the gunner nobody wanted in the one seat on that airplane that has no parachute in it. I climbed down into that steel ball on the morning of the 1st of May, 1943, and I pulled the hatch closed above my head, and I folded my knees up beside my ears. The first thing you notice about combat is how much of it is nothing. We lifted off Thurley in the morning and climbed through the English overcast, and the world went white, and then the world went blue, and then there was nothing but the drone of 4 engines and the cold coming up through the aluminum into my knees. Below me, France. I turned the turret slowly, right to left, left to right, the way they teach you, scanning the sky underneath the formation. Little squares of green and brown sliding past under my boots. Hedgerows. A road. A church tower somewhere, small as a pin. Nothing came up at us. I had spent 6 weeks on the ground, imagining this. I had built Saint-Nazaire in my head into something enormous. A wall of black flak bursts, fighters coming in from every quarter, men shouting over the intercom. That is what the veterans described in the huts at night. That is what Flak City meant. Then we crossed the coast and turned inland, and the guns of Saint-Nazaire barely spoke to us at all. There was cloud over the target. The bombardiers did what they could through the gaps. Through one of those gaps, I watched our bombs come apart in the water around the docks. White columns rising out of the harbor, one after another, missing. Not one fortress of the 306th was hit over the target that day. The most feared piece of coastline in France, on the 1st of May, 1943, had an off day. We turned out over the Atlantic and started the long swing home, and I sat in my ball with my knees at my chest and let out a breath, and I thought, is that it? Is that all it is? I want you to hold on to that feeling, because that is the feeling every man in that formation was having at that exact moment. And while we were all having it, the thing that was going to kill 3 of us was already happening up at the front of the group, and not one of us knew. The lead ship carried Lieutenant Colonel Claude Putnam, our group commander, a good flyer, the kind of man you want at the head of a formation. Somewhere over the water, his radio compass failed. Then his command consett went out. Understand what that means over the Atlantic in 1943. The route home from Saint-Nazaire ran west, out to sea, well clear of the French coast, and then turned north for England. A long, empty leg over open water, where there is no road, no river, no church tower. Nothing to fix your eye on. Nothing but grey water and grey sky, and a compass you have to believe. And the compasses in those airplanes were not good enough to believe. The navigator in the lead ship worked his figures and put us closer to England than we were. Not by much. Enough. We began to let down. I felt it in the ball before I understood it. That slow settling in your stomach as a bomber comes off altitude. 20,000, 15, 10. Below 5,000 feet, the air got thicker and warmer, and the whole group came down together like birds coming in over a field at dusk. Then the lead ship turned hard right. Somebody up front had seen a coastline. We came down under 1,000 feet, 800. Engines throttled back, noses up slightly, the whole 306th bomb group settling into a landing approach. Fat, slow, low, over what we all believed was England. I was in the lowest airplane in the formation, which made me the lowest man in the sky. 800 feet below the glass of my turret, close enough to make out the chop on it, the water was going past. Then I saw the boats. They were not fishing boats. The sky came apart. I have no better way to say it. One moment, there was the hum of an approach, and the next moment, the air around us was full of black and orange and steel, and it was coming up at us. Up from below, which meant it was coming through me first. That was not England. That was Brest. The French port of Brest, one of the most heavily defended stretches of coastline in occupied Europe, and the 306th Bomb Group had just descended to 800 feet directly over the top of it in landing configuration. I have heard it called a mistake. It was a mistake, the way stepping off a roof is a mistake. Everything after that is just physics. The flak batteries did not have to reach for us. We were handed to them. Coastal patrol boats opened up from the water. I could see the muzzle flashes winking on their decks, and the tracers coming up lazy, and then suddenly very fast. At 800 feet you have no altitude, you have no speed, and the gunners below, you do not need the 15 seconds it takes a shell to climb. They simply pointed and fired. I put my guns down on the boats and squeezed. The turret shuddered. Empty brass poured out. I hosed the water and the decks, and I have no idea to this day whether I hit anything at all. Then the fighters came. Focke-Wulf 190s up off the fields around Brest, and every one of them able to see exactly what we were. Heavy bombers at 800 feet, no fighter escort, nowhere to go. They came down through us. 2 fortresses of the 306th went down in the first minutes. The first one burned. I saw it go, a long streak of flame down the flank of the airplane, then a slow, terrible roll, and it went into the water with all 10 men aboard. 10. The second was hit hard and ditched in Brest Harbor. 4 men got out of it. Colonel Putnam understood in seconds and turned the group around, and we clawed for altitude and ran west, back out over the Atlantic. But the fighters had fuel, and we had none of the advantages. They followed us out. 10 miles, 15, 20 miles over open water, they were still coming in. And the lowest, slowest, most exposed airplane in that entire group was 649, the fattest target in the sky. I was watching a fighter's tracers come past our tail, little green threads reaching for us and falling away when the airplane was hit. There is no describing that sound properly. It is not a bang. It is a physical event that happens to your whole body at once. The ball turret rang like the inside of a bell with my head in it, and then everything in front of me went dead. The intercom, gone. No voices, no Johnson, no navigator, no waist gunners. Just silence in my ears where 10 men used to be. The turret power, gone. The handles did nothing. The guns did nothing. The ball hung there, dead weight, pointed wherever it happened to be pointed. I was sealed inside a steel sphere the size of a bathtub, on the underside of an airplane I could no longer see, with no power, no voices, and no chute. So I reached for the hand crank. This is the part I think about most. Not the fire, not the guns. This. You cannot see what is happening to your airplane from inside a dead ball turret. You cannot ask. Nobody can tell you. All you can do is turn a handle, 1 revolution at a time, and listen to your own breathing and wait for that hatch to come around. So I turned it, and I turned it, and I turned it, and when the hatch finally lined up, and I unlatched it and pulled myself up into the fuselage of that B-17, the inside of the airplane was on fire. A sheet of flame was coming out of the radio room. Another fire was burning back by the tail wheel. The smoke was black and thick, and it had a chemical taste to it, and it was moving down that fuselage like something alive. And then a man came out of the flames. It was the radio operator. He came staggering forward out of that burning compartment, and he did not stop. did not look at me, did not say one word. He went straight for the open gun hatch and dived out of the airplane. I got to the opening and looked down and watched him fall. He struck the horizontal stabilizer on the way past. I saw his body hit it and bounce off, and then his chute opened, a little white flower away below us, over the grey Atlantic. He had no life vest on. I believe the fire had already burned it off him. That was the first man. I turned around, and the right waist gunner was gone, already out, over his own gun. And the left waist gunner was stuck, half in and half out of his gun hatch, jammed there, the slipstream tearing at him. I got hold of him and hauled him back inside. I remember looking at him and asking him one question. I asked if the heat was too much for him. He looked straight through me and he said, "I'm getting out of here." That was all. 6 words, and he meant every one of them, and I am not sure he even knew whose hands were on him. So I helped him. I got the rear escape door open and I watched him go, and his chute opened clean. That was the third man. 3 men off that airplane, in under a minute, into open water, 20 miles off the French coast. Not one of the 3 was ever found. Now I want to be careful, because this is the moment where the story usually turns me into something I was not. People have said since that I stayed out of courage, that I made some decision in that fuselage about duty, or about the crew, or about the country. I did not. I stayed because the numbers were bad. We were far out over water. Nobody was going to be pulling swimmers out of the Atlantic that afternoon. The airplane was still flying, and a burning airplane that is still flying is, by a narrow margin, better than the sea. That is all it was. A short, ugly calculation made by a man who had spent his whole life making short, ugly calculations. Everything after that was just work. I wrapped a sweater around my face so I could breathe, picked up a fire extinguisher, and went at the radio room. I had barely started when something pulled my eye back toward the tail. I thought I saw movement, so I went back. It was Gibson. Sergeant Roy Gibson, the tail gunner. He was crawling forward on his hands and knees through the smoke, and he was covered in blood. I got him down and looked him over. He had been hit in the back. The wound was low and to the left, and from the way he was breathing, I was fairly sure the round had gone through his left lung. So I laid him on his left side. There is a reason for that, and I want you to understand it, because it is the one piece of training that stuck. If a man's left lung is filling with blood and you lay him on his right side, the blood drains across into the good lung and he drowns inside himself. On his left side, the good lung stays clear. It buys him time. I gave him a shot of morphine. I made him as comfortable as a man can be made on the floor of a burning bomber, and then I left him there, because the airplane was still on fire. What followed was the better part of an hour, and it had no shape to it. 3 jobs, 1 man, and none of the 3 could wait. The fire, Gibson, the guns. I would get into the radio room and start throwing burning debris out, and there was no need to carry any of it to a hatch, because the fire had already eaten holes in the side of that airplane big enough to throw it straight through. You could watch the Atlantic go past through the wall of your own aircraft. Then a 190 would come around again, and I would drop whatever was in my hands and jump for a waist gun and fire at him as he swept under us. Then cross the fuselage and get the other waist gun on him from the far side. Then back to the fire. The extinguisher fluid ran out. I found a water bottle and poured that on. I found the relief can and poured that on. And when that was gone, I was so angry that I urinated on the fire myself. And when that was gone, I beat at it with my hands and my feet until my own clothing began to smolder. Somewhere in all of that, I stopped and took off my parachute. I could not move fast enough with it strapped across my chest, so I pulled it off and threw it down on the deck and left it there. I am glad I did not take it off sooner. Because when it was over, when I picked that pack up off the floor of the airplane, there was a .30 caliber hole punched through it. .30 caliber. That is the size of the round a Focke-Wulf carried in the guns over its engine cowling. At some point in that hour, one of them had come through the side of our airplane and stopped in the pack strapped to my chest. I never felt it. I never knew. The one piece of equipment I was carrying that could not save my life, because there was nowhere to go but the ocean, is the thing that saved it anyway. The fire reached the ammunition boxes before I could get them overboard. And .50 caliber rounds began cooking off in the smoke, popping and snapping and going in every direction with nobody aiming them. I got out what I could through the holes. Now, here is a thing worth knowing. Everything I have just told you comes from my own mouth in an interview I gave a few days afterward. And I would not ask any man to take my word for what happened on my own worst day. You do not have to. There was another fortress, flying off Lieutenant Johnson's wing that afternoon, close enough to see straight into the holes in our fuselage. A pilot was Captain Raymond Check. His crew watched the whole thing. They described a stubby little ball turret gunner working feverishly, head-bobbing, heaving armloads of burning material out through the side of the airplane, then dropping flat to the deck for a few seconds to find air he could breathe, then getting up and doing it again. They watched me throw guns overboard, ammunition, equipment, anything with weight in it, because the tail was dragging, because Johnson was fighting that control column for every foot of altitude we had left, and every pound I put into the ocean was a pound he did not have to carry. By the end, they said, that airplane was flying on, little more than her skeleton. I should tell you that Captain Check did not survive the war. He was killed later that same year. Most of the men who corroborated my story never lived to grow old with it, and I was not the only man working in that fuselage. Staff Sergeant William Farenhold was on the other side of the radio room, fighting the same fire, and he fought it just as hard as I did. The difference was that the flames were blowing away from his side, and he did not have Gibson. Because that was the other thing, all through that hour. Every few minutes, no matter what else was burning, I went back to the tail gunner on the floor. He was in agony. Morphine will take the edge off a wound like that. It will not take it away. And a man lying on the deck of a bomber with a hole in his lung has nothing to look at but the ceiling and nothing to do but count. So I would lean down close to his ear and shout the same sentence. We're in sight of England now. Only a few minutes longer. It was not true. It was not true the first time I said it, and it was not true the 10th time, and it was not true the 20th. 45 minutes passed between the first time I said that sentence and the moment anybody on that airplane actually saw the coast of England. 45 minutes of lying to a dying man in a burning airplane over the Atlantic on the 1st of May, 1943. It was my first combat mission. The coast came up out of the haze, exactly the way I had been promising him it would. Cornwall, grey cliffs, green fields on top of them, and somewhere in there a runway. Johnson did not have the luxury of choosing an airfield. He took the first strip of concrete he could reach. Predanak. down at the very bottom of England, a fighter station that had never expected a fortress, and certainly not one in that condition. I remember very little of the landing itself. I remember Gibson on the floor. I remember the sound the fuselage was making, which was not the sound an airplane makes. We came down, wheels on concrete, rolling, and then the airplane broke in half. Right there on the runway. The fire had eaten so far through her structure that the only thing holding that bomber together was momentum, and when the momentum stopped, so did she. The tail settled onto the concrete behind us, like something lying down to rest. 7 of us walked away from those 2 pieces. 3 men were in the Atlantic. I have thought about that split for a long time. The men who went out with their parachutes on were never found. The men who stayed inside the burning airplane came home. There is no lesson in that. I have looked for one. Those 3 were not cowards. They were airmen in a fuselage, full of fire and smoke, with no intercom and no way on earth to know that the pilot still had control of the aircraft. They made the choice their training and their eyes made for them, and the water took them anyway. I made the opposite choice, and my reasons had nothing to do with virtue. I got to be an old man. They did not. That is the whole of it. The paperwork moved quickly. The recommendation went up through the group, and in July of 1943, the Secretary of War himself, Henry L. Stimson, came across the ocean to Thurley to hang the Medal of Honor around the neck of a 5'4" ball turret gunner. Lieutenant General Jacob Devers stood in the background. So did Major General Ira Eaker, who commanded the 8th Air Force, and a row of brigadier generals behind them. They had a problem finding me, because on the morning they came to give me the highest award that this country has, I was in the kitchen. I had come back late off a pass. Then I did it again a week later. So they put me on kitchen police, peeling potatoes, and that is where I was when the generals arrived. They took me off KP, cleaned me up, and stood me in front of the Secretary of War. A young correspondent for the Stars and Stripes named Andy Rooney wrote the ceremony up, almost exactly like that. He noted that a man who holds the Medal of Honor is entitled to a salute from a 4-star general. He noted that the little gunner from Cairo, Michigan took the whole thing in stride, and that all the brass who had crossed an ocean to honor him was, as far as he was concerned, just so much brass. He noted that it was the 2nd such award in that theater. The first had gone to Jack Mathis, posthumously, and Rooney wrote one line about the men on that station that I have never been able to argue with. They still did not know what to make of me. They had not made up their minds. He's a character, they said, and that was the only thing anybody was sure about. Somebody asked me afterward whether I had plans for the evening. I said I did not have a pass for that night, but I thought I could arrange one. Here is what the medal did not do. It did not make me a better airman. It did not make me easier to be around. It did not fix one single thing that was wrong with Maynard Harrison Smith. I flew 4 more combat missions after the 1st of May. 4. Then I was grounded. The paperwork used the language of the day. The doctors of that war called it operational fatigue, combat stress, a dozen different things depending on who was writing. Whatever they called it, the 8th Air Force was finished with me in the air. And a few months after a Secretary of War put that ribbon around my neck, the Army took my stripes, reduced in rank. Poor performance of duty. Think about that. The Medal of Honor and a demotion to private inside the same year on the same man. I have never met anybody who knows quite what to do with that fact. It does not fit the shape of the story people want. There is one more record from that spring worth reading, and it is not about me at all. In the days after the 1st of May, the 306th Bomb Group had to explain how it had lost 3 aircraft on a raid where the target itself never touched us. The post-mission report went up over Colonel Putnam's signature, and it is a blunt piece of writing. It said the navigation problem was made extremely difficult by poor compass equipment. It said that once the French coast was crossed, the radio aids were useless because the Germans jammed and bent them. It said a crew, therefore, had to rely entirely on the compass, and that the compass installations then in service were far too unreliable to carry that much faith. It said there was a better gyro compass already in existence, and that it ought to be issued to operational groups immediately. And then it said one more thing, in the flat voice of a man reporting on his own command. It said the leadership and navigation displayed by the lead group that day was hardly exceptional. 10 men in the water off Brest with their airplane. 6 more lost out of the one that ditched in the harbor. 3 from my own aircraft never found. All of it because a compass in 1943 was not good enough, and because there is no landmark on the open ocean to catch the error before it costs what it costs. That is the war people do not put on posters. A great many of the men who died in it were not killed by an enemy who outfought them. They were killed by weather, by equipment, by a needle that was a few degrees wrong over water. I came home in February of 1945. Cairo, Michigan gave me a parade. The town that had produced its own bad boy, the twice divorced, court-troubled, 31-year-old nuisance who could not hold a job or a marriage, turned out into the street for him. There was a photograph of my mother in the papers, and the caption made a good deal of how bewildered she looked. I understand the bewilderment. I never entirely got past it myself. The rest of the record is not his to tell. Maynard Harrison Smith found trouble again. After the war, more than once, and the men who wrote about him were never able to reconcile the 90 minutes over Brest with the 50 years on either side of them. He died on the 11th of May, 1984, 8 days short of his 73rd birthday. Sergeant Roy Gibson lived. That is the plainest thing that can be said about any of it, and it is worth saying by itself. And there is the parachute. It hung on a hook in the dark above him when he folded down into that steel ball on the 1st of May. 3 men on that crew reached for theirs, and all 3 are still out there in the Atlantic. He wore his through the worst of it, through the fire, through the waste guns, through the lying to Gibson, and it took a .30 caliber round that was meant for the middle of his chest. Then he threw it on the deck because it was slowing him down. The thing that could not have saved his life saved it anyway, and the thing he threw away is the only reason he could move. He never knew what to make of that. He only knew that on the one day it mattered, the man nobody on that airfield wanted to fly with was the man who stayed. And that 7 men went home because of a decision that had nothing whatsoever to do with being good.